I'm Anna Kate, and I will be doing the September-October 2020 topic analysis for the resolution resolved the United States federal government should enact the Medicare-For-All Act of 2019. So after I read that topic, it's probably pretty clear that this topic is about healthcare, and more specifically, it's about healthcare in America. And there really isn't that much ambiguity on, who the actor is in the resolution, or really what the resolution is asking. The resolution at its core is asking the question, would America be better or worse off with a universal healthcare system to replace the current American healthcare system? That means that the first thing we should do as debaters when we look at this topic is to really get an understanding of what the current American healthcare system is like. And so we can go into a little bit of background on that before we start talking about arguments. So the first thing to note about the American healthcare system right now is that it's a mix between government-funded healthcare programs as well as private insurers. So in the government-funded healthcare programs, it's things like Medicare and Medicaid that target specific groups of individuals, and you have to qualify for them. So not everybody is able to qualify, and not everybody who qualifies actually gets them. But the majority of healthcare in America is provided by private insurers, primarily through your employer. So if I was an employee for a company, I would probably have a work contract that stipulated some sort of healthcare that would be provided. Now, what necessarily isn't true is that healthcare is free if it's provided through your employer. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You still generally have to pay for healthcare in some way. There are things like copays, things like premiums, and things like deductibles that mean that you as an individual have to pay for your health insurance regardless of whether you have a company that provides health insurance. You still have to pay for it. So you've probably been to the doctor, and a lot of the times they ask you what your deductible is or what your copay is. And so copay is something where if I had a prescription for $100, I might have to pay $15 in order to meet my deductible, which is the amount of money my family or I have to spend before I can actually access my health care for myself that's free. So healthcare really in the status quo isn't generally free, especially for the majority of people who are getting it through private insurers through their employers. And that's what causes issues, because even though you might have healthcare included in your work package, it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually take use of it and can afford it. A lot of times health insurance and healthcare and doctor's visits and things like that are just too expensive for people, even if it is provided through their employer. So sometimes people don't get the help they need in the status quo. So another thing to think about right now, or another background piece of information that's worth looking into, is Obamacare, which many of you might be familiar with. It was a fairly controversial piece of legislation passed in the Obama administration, also known as, or it's officially named the Affordable Care Act, but many people just call it Obamacare. And the idea of Obamacare and the goal of Obamacare was to expand the amount of people covered by health insurance. It did this by expanding government-funded programs, as well as expanding, creating incentives and rules for employers that they had to provide health insurance. And while this legislation was effective at reducing the amount of people who didn't have health insurance, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people who do have health insurance even take use of their health insurance, and it also didn't completely reduce the amount of people who were uninsured to zero. So that's what this topic is talking about. What's pretty obvious is another thing you should look into before you start researching on the topic is what the Medicare-For-All bill actually does, or the Medicare-For-All Act does. And so you can spend time looking at intricacies of the bills if you feel like it, but what you really should know is that the main things about the Affordable or the Medicare-For-All Act is that it would create a totally government-funded healthcare plan, and it would abolish private health insurance. So there would no longer be health insurance in a world with Medicare for All, which means that everybody is getting their treatment and their health insurance through the government. And so that's what's called a single-payer system, where the only payer for healthcare is the government. And so, teams can look into specific wordings of the bill, specific provisions in the bill, but that's the general information I think you need to know before you get started on this topic. One thing I will say that is of note in this topic is that many of the arguments are very double-sided. So there are a lot of arguments that can easily be turned and easily be responded to and actually have both sides. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the arguments, just because I think it's really worth watching out for the fact that, there are very easy responses and very, easy turns to many of the arguments on this topic. But we will start by looking at the affirmative side, which is saying basically that universal healthcare is better for America. So the main argument, I would say that both sides kind of have a main claim or a main argument, or a main internal link into their arguments, or what basically their arguments are predicated on. So on the affirmative side, it's basically saying that access is good and access to healthcare is really good. So right now in America, there are around 25 to 30 million Americans who are uninsured, and that what the AF is saying is really bad, and that's a claim that I don't think can very easily be attested. Healthcare is a good thing for people who have it, and so the affirmative argumentation with access is just saying that increasing the amount of people who have access to healthcare in America is the most important thing. Because very simply, if you do pass a Universal Healthcare Act, it's universal and very few people end up being uninsured. So there are quite a few very easy ways that you can access the affordability, or that you can access that access to healthcare is really beneficial. The first way is you can say that it means more preventative care. So the idea of this argument is that right now in America, in the status quo, there are a lot of people who either are uninsured or who have health insurance that's too expensive or can't really afford to go to the doctor or go get medicine. So that means people in these situations generally don't go to the doctor and don't go get their medicine, and that leads to really harmful health outcomes, because then these people put off their health problems for way too long, and then they end up having to go to the ER and have to probably stay in the hospital for longer and have really high cost of care bills. And so that argument under the AF side basically says that if we have universal health care, there's no longer the incentive to avoid getting preventative care. There's no longer a monetary incentive to not go to the doctor. So if you go to the doctor, if you feel like something's wrong in an AF world, you just go to the doctor and you fix whatever's wrong. One impact of this that I think I've heard is that this potentially could decrease the amount of wait times in the ER, because the idea is right now a lot of people are waiting till the very last second, till they have to go to the emergency room to get treatment, and that's bad because it clogs up the ER, which means that mortality rates increase. So that's one argument on the affirmative side about access and why access benefits people. Another argument is that you can look specifically at groups of people who currently may not have as much access as more privileged groups, and to just talk about how structural inequalities in America are really important to address, and this is a great first step. Another argument you can make is that decreasing medical debt is really good. So again, in the status quo, people tend to not go to the doctor that much, but when they do, it's probably for a really severe treatment or something that needs to be treated. And that means that they will probably incur some amount of cost with that treatment, which in the end means that they could definitely be vulnerable to medical debt. There's a lot of statistics saying that a ton of bankruptcies every year in America are because of medical debt. So affirmative teams can look into the argumentation on that and see if it's a valid or a viable thing. Another thing just in general on the access arguments is that there's a lot of really compelling literature out there that basically says it's a lot of literature about how mortality rates go down once somebody gains health insurance, and quality of life and just stuff like that. And so I think that those arguments are very compelling. There's a lot of just really strong literature out there that does suggest that healthcare is really critical to individuals' health and well-being and mortality rates throughout time. Okay, and so on an argument that's not as clearly related to access, but is still an affirmative argument, it is the argument that there would be more innovative drugs in an affirmative world. So right now, big pharma companies can just price drugs however they want. And there's a lot of literature out there that says things like companies just like create copycat drugs, and copycat drugs don't add anything to the market. So it's like if I created, if I was the first person who created Advil, and then like, there's Tylenol and there are generics and everything like that. And like you can just kind of keep pricing it the way they want and they make money. But in an affirmative world, there's something in the Medicare-For-All Act that says that it would be a value-based pricing system. So since the government was the one paying for medications now, they would be the sole buyer of these medications, which means that they would basically have the full authority to determine how much it should cost because of the power they wield as the singular buyer in the market. And so a value-based pricing system means that the government pays more for more innovative and beneficial drugs. So if I created just a generic of birth control, the government probably wouldn't think that that was worth paying me a lot of money for. But if I created some amazing drug to, I don't know, treat coronavirus, then they would probably give me a ton of money. So it's basically just saying that innovation in drugs is really good. And not with COVID, and with Medicare-For-All Act, we would have more innovative drugs. For negative teams on turning this argument, I think that you can do research, and we're about to start talking about the negative case, but just a sneak peek is that a lot of the negative ideology and argumentation on this topic is that if we had Medicare for all in America, there would be a lot less revenue. So if big pharma companies are having a lot less revenue, they probably wouldn't put as much money into research and development. So this is just something like a quick response that you might want to look into for that argument. But okay, so now let's start talking about the negative argumentation. So much of the neg centers itself and relies on the internal link of Medicare for all leading to the loss of revenue. The idea behind that is because right now there's stuff to suggest that current Medicare rates do not pay hospitals back for the full cost of treatment. And Medicare rates, I think it pays maybe around 87 cents is the statistic I've read, while private insurance pays around $1.20. So that means that private insurance is what allows hospitals to be profitable, which has caused a lot of anxiety in America through just researchers and through hospital owners and things like that, that if Medicare for all was passed, there would be a lot less money going into hospitals, going into big pharma companies, and that would be a really bad thing for a few reasons. So as AF had most of their arguments centering around access, NEG has most of their arguments centering around loss of revenue, which means that the main clash in these debates is the clash between, is more access worth it if we decrease the quality so much overall? And I think that decreasing the quality is something the NEG has to very clearly win in order to win debates of those two frameworks, or of those two ideas. So the first neg argument we can look at is the idea that there would be hospital closures if we have Medicare for all. So what this argument is basically saying is that since there would be less revenue with Medicare for all, we would see less revenue specifically going into hospitals. And that would mean that hospitals would have to close down because they wouldn't have enough revenue to keep running and keep doing everything. I think with this argument, something affirmative teams definitely should look at is the cost of administrative costs in the status quo. I know that there's a lot of literature suggesting that a ton of doctors' time and energy and hospital money is put into managing the finances of having to charge all these different insurance companies for treatments, and in an AF world, that would totally be erased. So it's definitely worth looking into that to see if it might have an impact on hospital closures and might either be a net neutral, or if Medicare for all would be net neutral in terms of revenue for that, or if Medicare for all might actually benefit them. Another thing that I would say is that, I guess we'll talk about the more specific root of this argument before I talk about the next affirmative response. So a more specific root of the hospital closures argument is to talk about rural hospitals. So rural hospitals are obviously hospitals that serve rural communities, which means that the populations it's not like San Francisco where you can go to like one of like probably 20 hospitals. It's that you have one hospital, and these hospitals are actually really crucial to these rural communities because they're huge participants and creators of economic growth and job opportunities. And so right now the evidence or the literature says that rural hospitals are at risk. And that's really bad if we pass Medicare for All, because these hospitals will be losing even more money, which means that they'll be even less viable. There's a lot of great studies and stuff that say very explicitly that there would be like real threats to rural hospitals if we had Medicare for All. And so you can have a pretty strong impact off of this argument if you can win it, because if we shut down a rural hospital, that means that these people in the community don't have a hospital to go to anymore. Like, there's a lot of great evidence about how many people rely on rural hospitals, as well as these communities losing their jobs and like a huge economic player within their communities. One affirmative response to this argument that I would look into is how Medicare for All bills say that they're going to distribute money to hospitals. It seems a little far-fetched to assume that every rural hospital would shut down or that Medicare for All would let that happen. So I would advise AF teams to really look into like where the warranting comes from this and to see if there's actually provisions within Medicare for All Act to show like where they would get money from and like how they would distribute money and how they would like help out suffering hospitals. So that's definitely one way you could respond to this argument. So another argument is along the same lines. It's that again, the internal link is that hospitals are losing money, and the impact of that is that there are doctor shortages. And so basically what it's saying is that if hospitals don't make as much money, they can't pay doctors as much. And if they can't pay doctors as much, like doctor salaries get cut. And if doctor salaries get cut, that means that less people want to go to med school because med school is really expensive, and then they make less money. So there's a lot of like great evidence suggesting like how important doctors are and like primary care physicians are to economies and to mortality rates in communities. So if you find yourself running this argument, definitely look for evidence specifically about like how an increase in like physicians in an area impacts mortality rates, and that. What I would say to look at if you're on the AF and trying to come up with blocks for this argument, definitely think about kind of the status quo. We're in a situation where doctors are having like huge burdens placed on them with coronavirus, and definitely try to see if there's like any impact on people going into med school, people like doctors, doctors becoming like less likely to pursue med school or things like that. Another thing I would say is, again, look at administration costs, because right now there's a lot of evidence saying that doctors are burning out because of the lack of because of the overwhelming quantity of administration costs. And so, yeah, those are things to think about if you're hitting that argument on the affirmative. Another argument that's pretty common is that wait times would increase in a world where there's universal health care. This argument is basically just saying that since so many more people have health care, that means a lot of people are more likely to gain to go to the doctor, and that's a bad thing because it creates really long wait times. There's some evidence from, I think, Canada that suggests that wait times in Canada, a country with universal healthcare, are a lot longer than wait times in America, a country without universal healthcare. And longer wait times means, a higher chance of death, and you're less likely to get treated at the rate that you need to be treated. An affirmative response to this, or a way to look at this argument, is, again, this is kind of setting up the quality versus quantity debate, where it's like, is it worth giving more people access if the quality might suffer? Neg teams definitely should try to find the bright line, or try to find how much the quality would suffer. Another thing for affirmative teams is negative teams generally use evidence on Canada for this argument, but if I was an affirmative team, I would look into evidence on other countries with universal healthcare, because I think they generally do pretty well in terms of wait times, and say that there's really no conclusive evidence on whether universal healthcare specifically makes wait times worse. The last argument we're going to talk about is the argument on neg about developing countries. The argument is, again, that there would be revenue loss, but this time for big pharma companies or for pharmaceutical companies. And that's really bad, neg says, because if you are a big pharma company, right now there's like a lot of scrutiny you're under because you're making so much money. And because of that scrutiny, they say that big pharma companies turn to donate to third world countries and to developing countries and donate medicine that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to access. So if we have universal health care, that means that these companies don't make as much money, which means that they probably cut out their donations to developing countries because of the issue that, like, if they're not making as much money and if the public isn't paying for their goods, then why do they care about their reputation? And they also need to save money, so they might cut from their donations to developing countries. On this argument, if you're an affirmative team, you should definitely look into what the motivation currently is for these companies to donate to developing countries. But yeah, so those are some negative arguments on this topic. And just really quickly to round it out at the end, something I've been talking about through these argument analyses is that a big debate within this topic is the debate between quality versus quantity. And I think that both teams need to be very adequately prepared and very practiced in arguing that it's a better thing to either have access or either to have better quality. If you're a neg team, you have to prove that there's a really, really severe decrease to the quality of your healthcare, so much so that it doesn't matter that more people get healthcare or that you can turn these arguments that AF is running. If you're AF, you need to be able to prove exactly the opposite, that even if the quality suffers, it's worth having more people on healthcare. But with that, I wish everybody good luck on this topic, and I hope that you have fun debating.